Stop.
When it enters the battlefield, it draws a card. With restrictions and some selection. Yeah. Sometimes you attack. It's got a decent body, even has flying.
Wandering mind. Wandering mind. Wandering mind.
Hey, just a freaky flying grave.
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, Dragon Ball Z Appreciator Maddox.
Why are you doing that?
Because podcasts are all about sharing what you love with the world, Anthony. The listeners want to know. They appreciate your takes on cultural things.
I thought you wanted to start this out on a positive note with some positive energy, and here you have to bring up this garbage and slander me as a Dragon Ball Z appreciator.
You are going to get some hate tweets for that. I'm sure we have some Dragon Ball Z appreciators in the audience. Anthony's ready to fight you. He does not actually like Dragon Ball Z. That is a joke.
Go enjoy Dragon Ball Z if that's what you enjoy. Don't cast me as such a that kind of person.
Oh, that kind of person. What's that supposed to mean? I liked it as a kid. I doubt it holds up. I hear that somebody online has made a fan edit that basically cuts out all of the screaming. So it's kind of just the action.
So what's left?
Well, also as a show that was made
20
for
minutes?
as a 30-minute show that was made for commercial breaks on network television. It also, I guess, not network television, on for television. There's a lot of like repeating of things where like the last 30 seconds before they went to commercial break, then commercial break, they repeat that 30 seconds again. And when you add that up, that's like 10% of the episode is repeating what they did before the commercial break. So anyway, maybe if you are going to watch it, watch the fan edit that cuts out all that extra stuff to really just cut to that beautiful narrative.
I could, but I won't.
We're not alone, Anthony, because this is the third episode in our Crimson Vow set review where we're talking about the community response to the latest set, Crimson Vow and Crimson Vow Commander. And that, of course, means we need some help to tackle all these cards. So we're also joined by Parker, enviable deck drafter LaMascus. What's up, Parker?
Hey, it's, I don't know what deck you're talking about, but I'm glad you envied me, I guess.
You have drafted my cube in paper twice now, and both times you've had the deck that I have wanted to succeed. I look at your deck and I'm like, I hope Parker crushes everybody. I feel like we're in a similar sort of mindset right now with the kind of things we're trying to cultivate in our own cubes, and so you're drafting the kinds of things that I want to be successful, and I'm always most jealous of your decks at the end of the draft.
Well, I wish I'd piloted that particular deck better. I went 1 and 2 by the end of the night, so...
variance. Yeah, also,
maybe.
it could be an indication that I, as a cube designer, am failing to make the things that I want to be successful actually successful because people are just doing other stuff that I don't like as much and I'm not jealous of,
Yeah, maybe
Yeah, maybe you screwed up. It's possible. Just blame me. It's much easier than anything else. As I said, this is our Crimson Vow and Crimson Vow Commander community set review episode. So if you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, part 1 being the Crimson Vow mechanics, themes, and cycles from a game design perspective, part 2 being the cards that Anthony and I are personally adding to our own cubes from the set in that context, you should go listen to those because that, I think, provides some helpful background on what we think about the set and the cards within it. But now we're going to be talking about the results of our community survey and listening to the hot takes that you all have sent in. So this episode is really about the cards that the community broadly is excited about. I want to go over the structure of the survey and talk about what we asked of people so we can know what we're going to be discussing about each of these cards. But first, Anthony and Parker, I've been thinking a little bit. We have talked a lot on the show about this like bugbear in the cube world that cubes just tend towards the high power spectrum. And Anthony, I know this is something that kind of irks you a little bit because there's so much more design potential and design space at lower power levels, and it's easier to do on a budget, and it's more welcoming, and it's more approachable. It's often less complicated. I feel like you are like, more people should design cubes in this broader, lower range of power levels. And, why is it that every time a new set comes out, everyone's just most excited about the Broken Mythic rares?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's anything wrong with or negative about that kind of design experience and those desires. It's just, like you said, there's a whole bunch of other space to explore. And for me personally, just what I'm interested in is more the topology of Magic and the way the cards fit together. The fact that, they printed a bigger number is just the least interesting aspect of a new set.
They usually fit together in like a stack, usually. You take one off the top.
What now?
You said you're interested in how the cards fit together? Usually a stack.
Okay.
So we've talked at length about why this is, right? I think there's a lot of reasons why many cube designers tend towards higher power levels. And, we've talked about the fact that there's just like natural power creep in people's cube designs where they're more likely to cut cards that are underperforming than overperforming. We talked about how people want to play the powerful cards they have access to, or people are drawn to playing these cards that are banned in other formats or things like that. I actually think one of the big reasons, though, Anthony, this is maybe a subtle distinction, but I thought it was worth talking about in the show briefly, is that we talked about your additions to your regular cube for Crimson Vow, and you had like 4 cards, 2 of which were kind of like side grades to existing cards, so it was just like a little bit of a switcheroo. It wasn't really like a big new addition.
And one of them we ended up excluding live on the podcast.
And one of them live, as you read it, got cut from the addition list. It made me realize that the powerful cards are inherently some of the most novel cards in every set, right? Like, you said yourself, there's 24,000 Magic cards out there or whatever. If you're at a lower power level, there's a million different options you can run for a specific kind of effect. If you want a removal spell, if you want a 2-drop creature or whatever, at a lower power level, you have way more options to choose from. And as such, when a new set comes along, it's a relatively smaller addition to that pool of available cards, right? Like, the medium power cards in a set, or the cards that aren't at the peaks of power level, are very likely cards that are very similar to ones that have already been printed. And so the chances that those happen to like tick little boxes of interest for you and like make the cut over other cards that are existing in that larger pool is just much less likely than cards that are more powerful than anything we've seen before. When there's a new card that's like, that's the most powerful red Punisher 2-drop aggro creature that's ever been printed, it's a new thing. And so it's like one of the only new things in the set that's really going to like get cube designers excited.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. And I mean, we have talked plenty about how when you're designing a cube, you want to make the fun thing the optimal thing. Make what's good fun and vice versa, right? Because otherwise people are just going to do the good thing and they're not going to be doing the fun thing. And that obviously applies to all game design.
Mm-hmm.
And especially it applies to the actual design of Magic, not as a cube, but as a game being designed
by Mark Rosewater.
By Mark Rosewater. So yeah, when they have a new mechanic, they're definitely trying to make that new mechanic viable in Standard because they want you to play it. They want it to be exciting and viable. So there's definitely a lot that's true about that. At the same time, when we see these new mechanics, they are printing it at all rarities. They are printing it at sort of different power levels for different formats. So I definitely see what you're saying. And maybe we should also say that Planeswalkers were at some point a new thing, and the fact that they are printing more Planeswalkers still does expand that pool in a meaningful way. And I think that's actually a really great example where we've seen a lot of much lower powered Planeswalkers that just explore space that is much more narrow, which means the first Planeswalkers had to be powerful across lots of contexts because they wanted it to be fun for lots of people. But now people have kind of seen them, and the fact that it is no longer the big new splashy thing, I think it actually does allow them designing Magic to expand on the design space a little bit too. So I think it does kind of go both ways.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It was a slight revelation for me, right? Like, if you look at the 24,000 Magic cards, there are maybe 600 to 800 that are like viable on power level in a cube like mine. And there's probably thousands that are viable on a power level in a cube like yours. And so there's a much bigger pool to compete with when new cards come out for you. You have to displace something from a much bigger list of possible viable cards. I've already taken us down a rabbit hole. I can't help it. That's why I like making podcasts. But we got to stay focused because we have 25 cards to go through. The top 25 cards, according to our community survey. Worth noting, we're recording this a little bit before we close the survey, so these percentages might jump around by a little bit as the last couple of responses trickle in. But for the most part, these are pretty well set at this point. So if you hear any discrepancies between what we're talking about in the episode and what you see in the article, that explains that. Parker, do you want to walk people through the actual structure of the survey?
Sure. So we ask people every time we have a survey which cards people are testing, first of all, and also how those respondents self-rate their cards on a scale of 1 to 3, 1 being a test that's not very sure thing. It's more risky, perhaps, or the designer doesn't think it will stick around long term. And then 3, on the other hand, being a card that has a high probability of being a cube staple for years to come. That's how we describe number 3. And then 2 is kind of in the middle. So those are what we ask our designers.
And just to be clear, cube staple for that individual designer, right? Like,
Exactly.
I think we definitely don't subscribe to the idea of there being anything resembling a cube staple. In fact, if you go and look on Cube Tutor, there is no card that's played in more than like 40% of cubes or something. So there isn't really the idea of a broad cube staple, but for you, for the cube you're designing, you might see a card and be like, this is a new favorite card of mine. This is going to be in my cube forever, for a very long time. That's
Right.
what the 3s are.
One of my favorite thoughts about data, and I don't remember who said this or where I learned it, but it's this idea that you can't accurately measure something like the power of a card, but you can accurately measure people's perception about the power of a card. And that's what we're trying to do with this survey. We're measuring perception, not absolute power in some sort of objective sense.
Yeah, and even within that, it's not really power we're even asking for. It's perception of how likely you are to keep cubing this card. So
Exactly.
you might look at Oko and be like, that card is obviously very powerful, even though most people didn't think that at first, and decide to rate it very lowly because you think it's going to be too powerful and it's going to get cut from your list. So the rating is really just about how much each of our respondents is confident they're going to continue playing with this card in their cube, and not directly correlated with anything like power or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, so for Crimson Vow, I like to do some like descriptive statistics for the set so that we can compare it to other sets that we've conducted these surveys on. So cube designers who responded to us are testing a median of 7 cards from this set. That's about on the level of past sets such as Core Set 21 or Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Those had medians of 6 and 7. So you can kind of think of them as approximately equal in terms of how much excitement they're getting in the cube community who responded to us. In addition, designers who responded to us gave about 2 cards on average in Crimson Vow a rating better than 2.5, which is what we kind of internally define as a strong likelihood to be a staple for that respondent. So a median of 7 cards tested total, and a median of 2 cards better than 2.5 rating. That puts Vow pretty firmly in the same category as Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, Commander Legends, Magic 21. These sets were not exactly seen as, all-timers for the cube community. And I think we'll see that reflected in the more granular statistics.
Yeah, and reading the comments on a lot of the survey submissions and just talking about it on various Discord communities and on Twitter, seems like definitely the response to the set has been a little more tepid. People are like, yeah, sure, it's got some cards, but definitely not a slam dunk for many cube designers out there. Let's dive in. So we're doing the top 25 cards. There is one slight exception, though, because we got 2 matching hot takes about a card that doesn't quite make it into the top 25 cards of the set. And, can a take really be hot if somebody else said almost the exact same one? But we're talking about Voldaren Epicure. This is 1 red mana for a 1/1 creature vampire. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you create a blood token.
Hey guys, this is Martin from Rhode Island. My hot take for Crimson Vow is that Voldaren Epicure will be the red Thraben Inspector going forward. It has 1 less toughness, but it has pseudo haste with the 1 free damage on ETB. And while blood tokens are generally less effective than clues, I think red decks make better use out of the artifact for free, and some red decks can make use of the self-discard too.
Hey everyone, Cryonicity here, coming at you with a hot take for Crimson Vow. Might be the hottest take of the set. I might even be very wrong and fall flat on my face, but we'll see what happens. The card I'm going to recommend everyone try out is Voldaren Epicure. It's a 1 mana creature vampire 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, create a blood token. The key part here is create a blood token, and I feel like this is what makes it, the Thraben Inspector of red cards.
The hot takes we have are comparing this to Thraben Inspector and basically saying this is the red version of Thraben Inspector. Thraben Inspector is a broadly loved cube card played in lots of cubes with lots of different power levels. Is Voldaren Epicure the same? What do you think, Anthony?
I think it's a pretty different thing for a bunch of reasons. The biggest one just being that Voldaren Epicure doesn't actually draw you a card, or at least it doesn't generate card advantage. So I feel like Thraben Inspector is filling this niche of white aggressive cards that don't just leave you behind in terms of card advantage, where Voldaren Epicure does not. And I think that in an aggressive deck, it's sort of this interesting text of doing 1 damage to your opponent when it enters the battlefield makes up a little bit for being a 1-mana 1/1, which is not relevant, and it's not what a lot of cube designers are looking for. But I don't know how meaningful that actually is. And then I wonder if maybe they're trying to put this into a package where you want to blink this creature, but even that doesn't really make sense in red. So I don't know. It's a really interesting card. It does a couple little things, and maybe that does add up to a lot more than the sum of its individual parts, but I am yet to be convinced.
Parker, this card's only got 9% of our respondents testing it, an average rating of 1.9. Does not break into the top 25. Do you think people are underrating it?
It's a good question. Blood is a way of granting a card in your hand cycling 1, and I think this is something you talked about during the mechanics episode. And I'm not sure how powerful that is. Like, by contrast, Thraben Inspector, if you play it with an empty hand, you can immediately draw the card, whereas the Epicure only replaces your next worst draw. And I think that's a pretty big step down in power level. I also think it's true that you won't necessarily want to cycle immediately with the blood token. So I'm unsure, but these hot takes have convinced me that I should test it myself, maybe with an average rating of 1.9 or so, and see how it performs.
For my part, I don't think the comparison to Thraben Inspector is particularly apt. I think the much more relevant comparison, which I have not heard, is to Insolent Neonate, which is the 1-mana 1/1 red creature with Menace and the ability discard a card, sacrifice Insolent Neonate, draw a card. That was printed in Shadows over Innistrad, and to me, this is like a direct callback to that, which is basically taking that ability and decoupling it from the body, and in exchange you lose Menace, but you get 1 damage on ETB. Those cards feel very almost interchangeable to me. You said it doesn't generate card advantage, Anthony, which is true, but I would argue that in a very aggressive red deck, you often don't need your 4th or 5th land, and so you very often end up in a place where if you wait a couple turns, that blood token will be virtual card advantage because that land was effectively a blank card anyway. So I think that in a really aggressive deck, the blood tokens are closer to something like card advantage than they are in a regular deck. As the people that submitted the hot takes mentioned, red, I think, more than white is a color that is able to take advantage of discarding cards. So the fact that you get to discard cards possibly for value in a red deck might be valuable. I don't know if Insolent Neonate was ever played as like a discard outlet for Reanimator decks. Honestly, I haven't ever cubed with the card, and it's been a long time since Reanimator's been a theme in my cube, but I could see that being some of the reason people would be interested in 1-mana cards that effectively let you discard stuff. But I think for my money, this is a little worse than Instant Neonate, and so if you're not on Neonate, probably not going to be interested in this card either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as far as creatures in play, Menace is just a really interesting keyword that I really enjoy playing with, and it allows a cheap creature to then be relevant with equipment, be relevant with auras, other ways to pump up a creature's power. So I'd almost love to see like the coolest combination of these effects would be just giving it Menace, removing that 1 damage, and giving it the blood token so you can, keep it in play while still getting that cycling. I think that would actually add up to a really interesting card, but individually, I don't think for me in a lot of contexts I'm looking at, neither of those cards quite fits perfectly.
Yeah, and rarity doesn't matter, but these are both commons, and I think they're designed as commons to be pretty safe, to be, not pushing these things too far. And so it's a miss for me, but I can see how if you're interested in adding more depth to that 1-drop slot, and again, more aggressive 1-drops that have late game value, Voldaren Epicure is not far off, I think.
It is interesting and fits with this conversation that we're having. On the website, we graph not just how many people are rating it and how highly they rate it, but also what the community consensus for it is. So Voldaren Epicure falls way to the left, where there's very little consensus. So some people are rating it very high, some people are rating it very low, and I'm curious how that shakes out once more people get some playtesting in.
For sure. Parker, do you want to start us off now with the 24th top card?
Sure. By invitation only is 3 white for a sorcery. Choose a number between 0 and 13. Each player sacrifices that many creatures. So this board wipe with a twist, or I guess as the last episode of Lucky Paper Radio argued, it's really a modal spell, has 23 testers out of 204 at the time of recording for 11%, and they gave it an average rank of 2.1.
We talked about this card at length in our episode. It's one of the only cards. It's rare that there's a card that is slated for potential inclusion in both the Bun Magic Cube and the regular cube. But Parker, what do you think about it?
I think it's cool. I love the art.
The art is sick. We didn't mention that in our episode. It's really sick art.
Yeah. But despite that, it's about 2 mana too expensive for my format. So I'm just going to pass it by this time.
Is there anything a 5 mana Wrath could do to catch your eye, Parker? What would it take?
Destroy all creatures, win the game.
Yeah, something like, I don't know. It would have to be like Nissa Who Shakes the World good. So destroy all creatures, turn a land into a creature. That would be pretty cool, I think.
Anthony's getting ready to send you that Awaken Wrath that has the Awaken cost for like 8 mana or something. But on the front side, it is 5, if memory serves. So I don't think we have to go into that card anymore. We can't talk about them all in depth. But yeah, by invitation only is, I think, a very interesting addition to the suite of 5 mana Wraths. If that's something that plays in your environment, I think it's definitely worth the consideration over some of the other options that are out there if you're into giving Wraths a little more range, perhaps.
Next up, we have Cemetery Protector. So this is being tested by 12% of the community. It's another white card. It's 2 white for a 3/4 human soldier with flash. And this has this sort of ability that all this Protector cycle of cards has, where when it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard, and now it cares about that card and its type. And whenever you play a land or cast a spell of that type, create a 1/1 human creature token. So it's sort of an interesting combination of a couple different effects. I actually feel like the flash is really relevant, and just being able to play this in a controlling deck where you might flash in and destroy a blocker, something like that, or just flash it in if you don't have an instant to cast, ends up being pretty relevant. But a lot of people are also comparing it to Monastery Mentor, other creatures that just generate a ton of tokens. And I think that's very often how it's going to play. You're going to cast this, maybe you get to eat an attacker, and then exile a creature or an instant or sorcery, whatever kind of spell you have the majority of in your deck, and then start spitting out a bunch of tokens.
We also talked about this cycle pretty lengthily in our first episode, the Mechanics and Themes and Cycles episode. I still love the cycle. This placed about where I expected it to amongst the community. You know, it's a cool, flexible card that can fit in a lot of different decks and be a pseudo build around in those decks. But I do think realistically, very often it's just going to play out that you're not really going to adjust your draft a whole lot once you have this card. You're just going to play it with the knowledge of what's in play, what's in your deck, what's in your hand, and choose a card type that'll get you 1 or 2 tokens, and that's how it's going to play most of the time.
Abstractly, I really like the idea of a creature that will snowball value and accrue this snowballing token advantage. And you're also casting spells to trigger the tokens. So really a lot of value can be gained, and you can ambush attackers. It's a lot of value, but it's still vulnerable to removal, and it can be answered cleanly using that removal in a very short window. And that window where it's not quite immediate value, but it's also not quite very slow value is really dramatic to me. And I like that design in theory. I try to incorporate such designs into my own list. This one happens to be too expensive in terms of mana.
Yeah, for me, this card was kind of competing directly with a card I run in my cube, Restoration Angel. And honestly, what it came down to is just that Restoration Angel is just so beautifully simple. Like, the card does a lot, but mechanically it's very easy to understand, very easy to read, and can just fit in a lot of decks with its very simple abilities. And this card, I think, is equally flexible, but it's a lot of text. It's a lot of reading to get to the bottom of that. And so that is what kept it out of my testing list personally. Next up is another card from that Cemetery cycle. It is the blue one, Cemetery Illuminator, coming in at number 22. This card just edged out Cemetery Protector with 13% of our respondents testing it, and a slightly higher average rating of 2.1. This is 1 blue for a creature spirit. It's a 2/3 with flying. And this one basically has a future sight ability, which allows you to look at the top card of your library at any time, and you can cast spells that share a type with the card exiled by Cemetery Illuminator when it came into play. It also exiles another card when it attacks. Something I missed, I think, when we talked about this card in the Mechanics episode is that you can't actually ever play lands with it. And this is Something I think is a little bit interesting about this cycle is that, like, there's really nothing that's symmetrical about the entire cycle. I think maybe the only thing they share is they all exile a card on ETB, but the thing that card does, what they care about, what they actually, could do with that card are different. Many of the other ones do allow you to care about lands. This one basically doesn't. So you can exile a land, but you get no value for it. You can only cast spells. But this is basically, a reasonable body. I mean, 3-mana, 2/3 flyer is fine in a lot of environments. And the potential for ongoing card advantage is very promising, and I think is why people are interested in it. Also, very sick art.
Agreed. It is a little bit frustrating, to be honest. Well, frustrating is a strong word. It's notable that the cycle is so asymmetrical. I feel like that's a thing we've been seeing more and more in recent sets. Like, this really reminds me of the land cycle from Kaldheim, of the land set of the off-color activation, where they looked very much like a cycle and they had some sort of similar behaviors, but then there were all kinds of little things that were different about them. And to me, it sort of just feels like this started with a mechanic. Someone said, hey, we could have this mechanic where you can exile cards and then we care about the type. And then through a lot of heavy playtesting, they ended up just tweaking, this here, this there, so that things individually play a little bit better. And, they have a lot of knobs here to dial in the power level. And that makes sense individually, but then the result is it gets really hard to read these. I don't think it's a huge problem because it's not like these are commons that you're seeing.
They're mythic rare. So.
They're mythic rare, so it's not like we really need to, as players, leverage that mental shortcutting that you can do with really symmetrical types of cards. But it is notable that I feel like there's a little bit of a shift in some of the design process.
Yeah, I agree. A weird amount of symmetry and a weird amount of deviation from that symmetry across this cycle. Worth noting here, we talked about the white and the blue ones. The red and the green are higher on this list, but the black one, nowhere near the top of the testing list, not making it for almost any cube designers. Just more expensive, more conditional what it does, so that one was not anywhere near as popular.
I think it also just doesn't lean into the exiling mechanic in such an interesting way. It's kind of just like a removal spell. So we already have Ravenous Chupacabra. Do we need that layer of complexity?
Yeah, and at 6 mana, we have many other Chupacabra-esque variants that are much more reliable. I gotta say, it felt really good when we were playing our pre-release, and you were forced to just run out the thing and be unable to kill anything with it in our pre-release games.
Yeah, I mean, when you run out of cards in your hand and you have a 6 mana 4/4 menace, you gotta just play it.
Yep, you do.
Okay, next is Fleeting Spirit. It's 1 and a white for a 3/1 creature spirit. It has the abilities white, exile 3 cards from your graveyard. Fleeting Spirit gains first strike until end of turn. And discard a card, exile Fleeting Spirit, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we have a variant on the Adanto Vanguard or Seasoned Hallowblade class of 3/1 attackers that can protect themselves. It's being tested by 13% of the Cube community who responded to our survey with an average rating of 2.0.
This is my flag for a most overrated card of the set, I think. I watched the conversation on the Discord slowly shift, where when this was first spoiled, people were like, oh man, this is like way better than Seasoned Hallowblade and Adanto Vanguard. It's going to get right in my cube, be there forever. And within 45 minutes, they were like, actually, maybe it's about as good. And then pretty soon they came around to what I think is my evaluation of this card, which is that it is so much worse than Seasoned Hallowblade or Adanto Vanguard. There are edge cases you can invent where you'd rather have Fleeting Spirit over one of those other 2 cards, but this doesn't do the one thing that those other 2 cards do, which is their most powerful mode, which is you play it on turn 2, and then you just start chewing through blockers constantly. I mean, this thing, the way that it protects itself by exiling it and then coming back on the end step means that you are not going to be eating things in combat. If you want to protect it, you are just going to not deal any combat damage to that blocker, unless you also have cards in your graveyard you can exile, which is a whole nother hoop to jump through. I think his card is much worse than it looks.
I mean, I think the thing that makes that comparison actually more meaningful is the first ability. It gaining first strike is pretty damn close to gaining Indestructible on your Adanto Vanguard because, what are you attacking into, a 4/4 and then just discarding a card to save your creature? That's not what's happening.
Yeah, but exiling 3 cards from your graveyard is a steep cost, and it costs mana. I mean, both Adanto Vanguard and Seasoned Hallowblade are free to protect them in terms of mana. I mean, their costs do not cost any mana. I think if they cost any amount of mana, it would be maybe much worse. If you just took Seasoned Hallowblade and replaced discard a card with pay 1 generic mana, don't discard a card, I think that's a worse card than Seasoned Hallowblade is, which is maybe a hot take. But the fact that that is something you can do for free, the threat is always up, there's always threat of activation, you can't be tapped out and your opponent knows they can forked bolt your Seasoned Hallowblade, that makes a huge difference.
Ultimately, I do agree that this isn't going to do that thing of eating through a bunch of blockers. I think what it does differently potentially is you have that pretty limited resource of your graveyard, but because you can give this first strike, your opponent knows that they can just start chump blocking and losing their creatures, but that's not necessarily going to be good for them. So I think where this is actually going to be the most powerful is in board states where your opponent just can't really afford to deal with your threat of activation and instead just start taking the damage. So I think it's more like a creature that's just going to get in damage than something that's going to deal with a bunch of chump blockers.
Right. And I agree that once you're in that board state, Fleeting Spirit has a little bit of an edge because you often won't have to pay that white mana because your opponent knows you can, and so they just can't afford to throw stuff away. My point is, that's the board state you're in 100% of the time with Adanto Vanguard and Seasoned Hallowblade, because you can always activate that protection ability. You could always have the option to turn any card in your hand into a 0-mana removal spell for a blocker with Seasoned Hallowblade. I don't know if you disagree, Parker. Do you think this card is actually going to still be in 13% of our respondents' cubes in 12 months?
I do not think it's very good. I've played it a couple times in draft, and it's been fine because it's draft, but I have not activated it. I have not felt good about activating it or trying to build or play towards activating it. So I'm with you. I think it's much worse than its compatriots.
I would also just say from a design perspective, there's a lot going on here, and those abilities sort of seem like they fit together. Like, oh, I can discard cards, and then I can use the cards as a resource. But there isn't really an exciting payoff for doing that whole cycle. It's like, oh, cool, I discarded some cards. Now I get to give this guy first strike, and I killed a blocker. Like, it's not... It doesn't tell a story that I think is exciting, just mechanically.
Yeah, I mean, the most exciting mode, I think, is like you attack into I guess like the first strike wouldn't matter. Yeah, you're right. I don't know. I was thinking there's some circumstance where you would care about giving it first strike and then exiling it after first strike damage, but you wouldn't because it has first strike. And
then it sort of like seems to imply, oh, there's something about blinking that you're doing with this card, but what? I don't really see how that fits with other cards.
Yeah. It's a miss for me. All right, Anthony, you got to read all this rules text on this next one, big guy. Get ready,
baby.
Buckle up.
You know how I feel about double face cards, so I'm just gonna only read the front because that's all you're gonna see in a draft anyway. So
there you go. Very fair.
All right, so in again, 13% of our respondents are trying this out in their cube. It is Voldaren Bloodcaster. 1 and a black for a 2/1 vampire wizard with flying. When Voldaren Bloodcaster or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. And whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, transform Voldaren Bloodcaster.
And then we can't see the back because we're in a draft and we're in a sleeve.
But we assume that's upside, right? So
I'll read the back quickly. It's Bloodbat Summoner, creature vampire wizard. It's a 3/3 flyer, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat creature with flying and haste in addition to its other types. So it flips and starts turning those blood tokens into bats, which is, I mean, a cool flavor. I like the blood bats on the backside of the art. That's kind of chill.
Blood bats are very cool.
Pretty chill. There's a lot of text on this card. I don't think much of it matters for why most cube designers are playing it, because blood is a mechanic that unless you're going really deep on it, we can see from these results that most people are not going really deep on blood, that you are never going to flip this card, because you are not going to get 5 or more blood tokens in a deck where you just have a couple incidental blood generators in your like generic cube.
Right. On its own, it says if 5 other non-token creatures you control die, you flip this, which, you know, a 3/3 flyer is a solid card. It's going to do stuff, but I don't think a 3/3 flyer that you're getting on, you know, turn... What turn is that going to happen? Like, it's going to scale with the context, and at any scale, that's not the most meaningful part of the card.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people out there are imagining their, you know, loops with Gravecrawler and Carrion Feeder, and just imagining turning this thing on in their Aristocrats deck, and that may happen for sure, but my impression is that most people are playing it because it's a 2-mana 2/1 flyer that dies into a blood token, which is perfectly reasonable card, and honestly, if that's what the card was, instead of having all this other text, I might be more inclined to actually test it. But the extra text is what's keeping me at bay here, even though I think a 2-mana 2/1 flyer that dies into a blood token is a pretty good card.
I agree. I think the floor on this is very strong, and there's also a lot of additive distraction going on with this card, with the blood, with the back face. A lot of that won't matter, but it's intimidating, and it'll also make it seem like it's worse than it really is. I also want to point out this is our highest rated blood token producer in the survey. It's not a very high rating, only 13% of our respondents. And I think part of the reason is it's paying the double-faced tax that we've seen in prior surveys. I think last time we talked about how Brutal Cathar was seeing about a third as much play as it might see had it not been double-faced. I think this is paying a similar tax, but it still has some kind of challenges in terms of being an appealing design for the average cube.
Yeah, I mean, I really do like some of these cards like Midnight Reaper, which whenever your creatures die, you draw a card. Those kinds of cards can be a lot of fun to play with because they, you play them first main phase, and then you can make weird attacks and put your opponent in difficult situations. The fact that this is giving you blood tokens rather than just drawing cards, I think is really interesting because, frankly, I think blood tokens are really interesting.
Yeah.
So having a cheap card with a reasonably high ceiling that can create a bunch of blood tokens, which add a lot of opportunities for interesting kinds of gameplay and complex sequencing, that's all great. I'm definitely not considering it. Well, we talked about how I'm probably going to add a double face card, but a double face card that has a lot of meaning, and the double facedness really plays into what the card is all about. When it is such an edge case situation, that really does turn me off. So I could definitely see a lot of people that might be interested in this, either for the interesting mechanics, interesting play patterns, or a high power level, would still be taking away points because of it being a double face card.
Next up is a card that I am planning on testing in my own cube. It is Kessig Wolfrider, with 14% of our respondents testing it, an overall rating of 2.0. This is a 1-mana 1/2 with Menace. It's a human knight, and it says, pay 2 and a red, tap it, exile 3 cards from your graveyard to create a 3/2 red wolf creature token. So, aggro creature with upside in the late game, though, as we talked about in our personal cube additions episode, I don't think it's particularly exciting on either axis. As a aggressive 1-drop, it is kind of lackluster in terms of its impact on the board and how fast it chips away at life totals. And as a late game mana sink and way to use your graveyard as a resource, I also think making 3/2s is not the most impactful thing on a lot of boards. So I've actually cooled a little bit on this card. It was in my skeptical, maybe I'll find room for it, more like a 1 for me in this particular set. And I've cooled enough that I'm not sure I'm even going to find a cut for it. It might not even see testing for me.
Our next card is Wandering Mind. It's a 1 blue-red 2/1 creature horror. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is a variant on Cloud Conceer, except it only gets non-creature cards, but it also has some selection. So it's got some appeal in these red, blue-based Xerox decks, in the Prowess-style decks, maybe even in Artifact-style decks, because it keys off of non-creature. So I'm excited for it. I'm going to be testing it provisionally. I think it'll be neat. I'm not expecting this to revolutionize my Is It section or anything, but I do like it.
I had a thought about this card, Anthony, which is that, would you consider this for the regular cube in the context of the fact that the Cloud Conceer was determined to be too powerful in the regular cube? Does making it gold and switching up how it works a little bit, making it a little bit more selection, but limiting what you can grab, does that make it enough of a payoff to be in the red-blue color pair that you would consider for the regular cube, or is it not what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that at that sort of power level and within those goals, this could make a lot of sense. 6 cards is a lot of cards, so honestly, I might be a little bit less excited about it just because of how much time you're going to be sitting there making decisions. I don't necessarily like creating those opportunities for players to hem and haw too much, but I definitely agree that it definitely could fit nicely there, and the fact that it is gold is a reasonable way to sort of balance that power.
Parker, are you on Cloud Conceer in the cube in which you plan to test Wandering Mind?
I'm not, and I think it's because I think the differential in my evaluation is that Wandering Mind will never draw a land when you don't want a land. By turn 3, in my environment, you already have to have your mana developed, so drawing a land doesn't help you. It doesn't unlock more spells in your hand. All your spells have been unlocked by the time you get to 3. So what I really need out of my 3 mana draw a card effect is a body to stave off aggression or to do some beating down of its own. This has flying. It's great for that. And also, not just a card, but I want a spell. And that's what Wandering Mind
days.
gives.
You want days or Force of Will is what you want. Something
I
you can
definitely
cast
want
for free.
days. But I have to reveal it, so maybe I don't want days.
I guess that's true.
I just
you
want
do have
Lightning
to
Bolt.
reveal it. Yeah,
Yeah.
Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt will have to do, I suppose.
And we have to point out that the illustration on this guy is incredible. It's a big flying brain dude. I really like that it's sort of a nice sort of bridge between... They've thrown in a couple little nods to the Shadows over Innistrad, Eldritch horror kind of themes. And the other ones are a little bit more on the nose. It's, here's a seagull with a squid face and a moose with a squid face. And this kind of bridges the sort of like Reanimator Frankenstein style zombie plus a little bit of this sort of tentacle noodliness, which I think is pretty cool.
Absolutely. I'm not going to lie, that's a component of why I want to test this card.
Good picture.
Next up, we've got Occult Epiphany. So this is being tested by 15% of our respondents. So this is an instant for X and a blue. Draw X cards, discard X cards, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying for each card type among cards discarded this way.
Occult Epiphany is the card I'm most excited about from Crimson Vow. I think this is a card that's going to perform well in any environment that cares about the graveyard, and that it's going to play well in a variety of different strategies. I've been seeing discussion on the Cube Talk Discord that the primary mode for this card will be to use it to discard a Reanimator target on turn 2, which is something that's not doable by most of the commonly run looters, with the upside that you might discard a creature with multiple types, like a Sundering Titan. While this is certainly a powerful mode and provides good flexibility, I think that trying to understand the power of Occult Epiphany based on any one use case won't capture what makes this card so exciting. It's easiest to understand the play pattern when considering it in a combo-y Reanimator deck, where its purpose is to get specific cards into the graveyard. But even as my cube moves away from the more combo-centric graveyard synergies and into more value-oriented interactions, I get no less excited about Occult Epiphany. Up until about X equals 4, it makes tokens on rate with Secure the Wastes, creates a board presence more widely and efficiently than Shark Typhoon, while providing card selection, and it fuels the graveyard like a Frantic Search or a Faithless Looting. It's a supremely flexible card that contributes to both token and graveyard synergies, while also reaping all the benefits of being an instant. I think that Occult Epiphany is the most uniquely and flexibly powerful card from the new release, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be in my cube for a long time.
We talked at length about this one too. It's still one of the cards I'm most excited about. But Parker, again, I'm going to lean on you for somebody whose opinion I've not heard about Occult Epiphany yet. Enlighten me.
I like it. It's an alternative to Secure the Wastes. It can still be cast on an empty hand. Like, you'll be cycling cards in and out of your hand, but you're still going to generate tokens. And so that's not a downside. You just lose the selection, but you're still getting flying tokens. So I like it. Well, I should say I like it in a mechanical sense. And
you don't sound very excited about it. The tone of your voice is not like, ooh, yay.
It's true. It does not spark joy for me.
You don't have a fun, flirty energy about this card, Parker.
I don't love the art. It's, blue magic pouring out of somebody's eyes.
I think it's pouring out of the book through his eyes, right?
That's my read.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it. And I don't know if I've told y'all this, but I've started to curate my cube in the sense where I don't allow wizards to tell me which cards to test. I say, wizards, I want you to print me a card to test. In other words, just because a card is powerful doesn't mean I'm going to test it. It's because I want to test it. So I've just kind of made explicit for myself this calculus of a card's aesthetics, its beauty, its gameplay. So I'm just not holding myself to testing every powerful card that gets printed.
I actually think this card is pretty interesting. I do often enjoy these sort of like, especially instant speed, like card filtering cards that it's not just like Dig Through Time or Treasure Cruise where you're just going to draw a ton of cards, but you're actually sort of down cards by casting it. So making you make difficult choices and figure out how you're going to make use of this most creates some interesting decisions. And the fact that this forces you to discard real cards, you're not just discarding a land, you want to ideally discard an artifact creature or something like that, and potentially a land. I think that there's just a lot of interesting decision space. I haven't actually gotten to cast this yet, but I think it's going to play out just much better than it reads. And the fact that
pretty good too.
It sort of puts you down a card, but what you get for that card is the real value of some number of flying tokens. And flying tokens are much, much better than non-flying tokens. So I think the comparison to Secure the Waste is almost not quite relevant.
Yeah, I mean, it does have superficial similarities with Secure the Waste, but I like Secure the Waste most in what is already like my white-blue decks, basically, like my white-blue control, or maybe like a tempo deck, where I have a lot of instant speed stuff, and then if I don't need to counter a spell or remove a threat or flash in a Restoration Angel, I can just dump mana into Secure the Waste to build up my board. And so I'm excited to see how that kind of effect will play in other color combinations, in a blue-red deck, in a blue-green deck, where you can really ramp and, pay a lot for X and draw a bunch of cards and dump Uro in your graveyard and just feel very powerful. So, I'm still excited about the card, and interesting to hear that it doesn't spark joy for Parker, but you know what? No cards for every person, so that's just how it goes. All right, next up is an uncommon in Reclusive Taxidermist. This is tested by 16% of our respondents for an average rating of 2.1. It's 1 and a green for a human druid. It's a 1/2. Reclusive Taxidermist gets +3/+2 as long as there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, and it taps for 1 mana of any color. I think this is occupying the same space as a lot of 2-mana mana dorks that tap for a mana of any color that a lot of people are including. All of your Sylvan Caryatids, all of your Paradise Druids, all of your... quick, name another one. There's others. There's a lot of others.
Werebear.
That doesn't tap for mana of any color.
Oh, you're right.
But yes.
I wasn't listening. I was skyfalling Werebear.
Fair enough. Werebear-esque. But instead of whatever those other upsides are, the hexproof and greater toughness on Caryatid, or the conditional hexproof on Paradise Druid, here what you're trading is potentially a late game 4/4, which is pretty relevant. So I can see why people are interested in this card, and I hope it works for them. I hope it brings them joy.
Our next card is Torens, Fist of the Angels. Costs 1 green-white for a legendary creature, human cleric. It's a 2/2 with training, and whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 green and white human soldier creature token with training. It's being tested by 16% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.1. It's a little bit of like the opposite of Monastery Mentor in that it triggers off of creatures and it creates the tokens that can grow. It grows itself. However, I think there's a key difference in the way I evaluate this card, which is that if I have a cheap creature in my hand, why haven't I played it already? And that can't necessarily be said for Monastery Mentor. There are counter spells that you might not play. There are removal spells. And sometimes, if you don't need to cast a cantrip like Brainstorm or whatever to hit your land drops, maybe you won't do so because you have other things to spend your mana on. So Monastery Mentor, I think, has a greater potential to get immediate value. Torens still snowballs, but I think it's going to be harder to get that immediate value in the face of removal.
Yeah, this card I really like. I'm drawn to it. I feel like it might be a card that I will test at some point and think I may be overlooked in these first weeks of the cards being spoiled. And I hear what you're saying, Parker. I do think it's not as powerful as a Monastery Mentor. And it's not just a thing you said, which is that you don't have a lot of reasons to sandbag cheap creatures in your hand the same way you have reasons to sandbag cheap spells. It's also that, frankly, at the highest power levels, the spells are better than the creatures. So your Monastery Mentor deck, your Young Pyromancer deck, is paying you off for playing with a lot of the most powerful spells in a lot of circumstances. And Torens is paying you off for a much more fair strategy. You're just going to play creatures and attack with them. That said, I do really like it. I like that it's only 3 mana, this kind of build around you payoff thing. I think 3 mana is the cutoff for me, where if it's any more, it's not even close to consideration, but 3 mana is that spot where it could go either way. If this was, like a 1/1 with training for 2 mana, I would be all over it. Oof, that'd be so sick. I'd be super into that. At 3 mana, I think it's kind of right on the cusp, and that, to me, means it's a well-designed card. It's not overly pushed. It's kind of right there, where it's if you're interested in this thing, you can go for it. I do really like the idea of having additional rewards for playing a creature-dense deck. Thalia Garden of Thraben in a green-white deck that's all about creatures is one of the only creature payoffs that I have, in the sense that you can reliably cast your spells without being taxed, and your opponents likely cannot. So I like the idea of having more of those creature payoffs, and Torens might fit that bill for me eventually, but I'm a little wary of it just on power level. I don't want to include a card that's just going to be a trap if it's not going to hang on power level in my environment. But I do really like the design quite a bit.
But this is not a podcast about power level, and I think that a lot of people have cubes that curve a little bit higher. They're about creatures and big splashy stuff and building up complicated board states. And in those contexts, like, this feels perfect. Like you said, it's still pretty cheap. So if a lot of your, decks curve sort of peaks around 3, so you still have some 3, 4, 5 drops in your deck, maybe even bigger, there are reasons this is going to trigger. You do want to follow up this with a bigger creature so that you can actually train it up. And I think getting that sort of achievement unlocked of, I made a whole bunch of creature tokens and they all have training, and now when I attack, they, all the way down the chain, everybody can train everybody, and I'm building up my huge army.
It's going to be very satisfying.
Definitely see that being a really satisfying, create some really satisfying gameplay moments.
I will say the other thing in my specific environment that kept me from throwing this in my testing list was that a lot of my creatures, I say with scare quotes, especially in green, are not actually creatures. I have stuff like a Seeker's Chariot, which makes tokens, which is effectively, you're paying 4 mana for 2 2/2s, but it's not a creature spell. Similarly, Ranger class, not a creature spell. A lot of Planeswalkers that their primary role is making tokens are not creature spells. And so there's a lot of situations where the fact that this is triggering on cast a creature spell as opposed to a creature entering the battlefield makes it more suspect and obviously less powerful than if it was the former.
But like you said, being an actual payoff for creatures can be an asset as well. And I can see in some environments saying, well, here's a 4-drop that's a artifact that makes creatures, and here's a 4-drop that actually is a creature. Having something that actually influences your decisions and forces you to go in what would in a vacuum be the suboptimal route, I think actually creates some interesting gameplay experience.
I agree.
And there's some exceptions to go the other way as well. Like, you can think about evoke creatures at the very least, and there've got to be other things that count as casting a creature spell, but sort of function as instant sorceries, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like other evoke.
Exploit,
Which
is in the set. Anthony, consideration for the irregular cube rare module.
I think that's a great idea.
I love the card.
It.
I want to play it somewhere, and so maybe that's the home for it in our play group.
In at 17% of our testers with a rating of 2.2 on average, we have Ascendant Packleader. It is green for a 2/1 wolf. It enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it if you control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. And whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, put a 1/1 counter on Ascendant Packleader. I think this is a tidy little big green cheap creature. It's sort of like a Pelt Collector in that it is both a cheap thing that you can play early and it grows with the game, and it also sort of in terms of sequencing works a little bit more flexibly in that you can play it later in the game.
I think there's an inherent tension in this card in that it's hard for me to imagine the deck that both wants a 1-mana 2/1 and also has a decent density of spells with mana value 4 or greater. The 1-mana 2/1, like, it's a commonly embraced stat line amongst cube designers for like aggressive decks. It's not a bad stat line, but in the grand scheme of board states you can achieve in Magic the Gathering, it is a pretty bad stat line. A 1-mana 2/1 is often not worth a card in a lot of places. The random 1-mana 2/1 that is in a set ends up being pretty unplayable and limited most of the time, for example, because there's not enough density of those things to go around. So I feel like unless you are pretty deep on a green aggro strategy, you're likely not going to have a deck that can really give Ascendant Packleader its home unless you're, a 2-color aggro deck. You have enough fixing to support true 2-color aggro in green-white or green-red or something. And if you are truly supporting that aggro deck that has enough redundancy for this 1-mana 2/1 to make its body relevant through flooding the board with them, then how many times are you actually going to trigger in that deck? How many other 4-mana value spells or greater do you actually have going on there? So to me, it reads like a pure +1/+1 counter payoff card. And the fact that it's a 1-mana creature that cares about these +1/+1 counters is what really matters. And its base stats are kind of irrelevant, would be just as good if it was a 1/1 or a 1/2 or whatever. So I guess the stat line just is kind of weird to me. Also, we get wolves of all different sizes. I feel like in Magic, they often try to establish like the canonical size of creatures. And we have wolves that are 2/2s, 2/1s, 3/3s, 3/4s. They're just all over the place. Wolves can be any size, apparently. Very spookily, coming in at the 13th most popular cube card in this set is Overcharged Amalgam. This is 2 blue for a 3/3 with flash and flying and exploit. And when Overcharged Amalgam exploits a creature, counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. 17% of our respondents are testing this card. Average score of 2.1. This is a nice little modal card. What do you think of this, Anthony, from a design perspective?
So I think there's a little bit of a funny tension, which maybe is positive. I don't know. Maybe you can help me decide if it's positive or negative. But the fact that it has flash and it's a flying thing, I want to sometimes maybe be able to flash it as a blocker, but then if they're going to cast something that I want to counter next in their main phase, I might just get myself... So am I just overrating that altogether, and I'm not flashing this into block stuff? This is really just a counter spell.
I think you'll flash it into block stuff sometimes. There are definitely times where its value on board is better than a thing you could hypothetically counter. I had a similar thought about this, which is that it felt like it had a weird tension to me, which is I immediately compared it to, again, Restoration Angel as like a decent-sized flash flyer. And I was like, this is weird because Restoration Angel can protect one of your creatures from a removal spell by just flashing it in and flickering it. And this can kind of do the same thing because you can flash it in to sacrifice the creature that we're going to remove anyway to counter the spell that was going to remove it. But that doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't work.
So you would, I mean, it does work, but you would flash it in and you'd sacrifice a lesser creature, presumably, then to counter that spell. It's got a lot of text, but ultimately I think is like kind of clean. This actually reminded me a lot of Eben Death Draco Lich for some reason as like a decent sized flyer that seemed like it would have a reasonable place and have a lot of like utility, but that 4 mana slot is there's so much competition for powerful cards at that 4 mana slot, but people seem to really like this one. It is rated pretty highly. Again, our 13th most popular card in the set.
Anthony, I think you can probably flash this in to counter an attack's triggered ability on like a Dreadhorde Arcanist or whatever.
Now
there you're doing
that's
it.
the spicy
and there's
move.
the value, I
Ooh,
think.
Baby.
Yeah.
This card is so good, they can unban Dreadhorde Arcanist in Legacy now, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's a hard counter to Dreadhorde Arcanist in Legacy. We've talked a lot about art on this episode, and I'm worried that new listeners might think that we only care about art, but I do have to mention this is one of my favorite arts in the set. This big, enormous zombie horror with like just limbs and weapons coming out of all kinds of places.
Hey, this is a podcast about art. This is a podcast about the most beautiful work of... That's not true. A very good work of art, Magic the Gathering.
Our next card is Reckless Impulse. 1 and a red for a sorcery. Exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. So this has been reviewed fairly positively, an average rating of 2.3, 18% of our respondents. Yes, it is a high rating. So, but it's only 18% of our respondents, which suggests to me that it's a small contingent of people who are really looking for a critical mass of this kind of effect. And so they're rating it highly because they already know they want it.
Yeah, oftentimes, the rank and the testers will be pretty correlated in the results of a survey, so it might seem silly to ask for both, but this is a good example of where this stands out. Like, this card rates higher than most other cards in the survey until you get to, like, the top card, basically. It has the highest rating of any of the cards in the survey. So it's something people are rating very highly, but are not that many people are testing. So it does say that the people that are testing it think it's really good, maybe one of the better cards in the set, even though a lot of people just are overlooking it completely.
Exactly. I've seen a lot of discussion comparing this to Expressive Iteration, which I've been playing lately, and I think it's quite strong, both in Historic, where I've gotten some reps in with it, but also in my cube. So I see why they're excited, and if I open one, I will certainly test it.
The other thing that I think is contributing to the high rating here is that Reckless Impulse is a common, and I have to imagine for power-motivated Pauper Cube designers, this is kind of a slam dunk, right? Like, if you're just trying to play the most powerful commons, this probably makes the list into almost any cube.
I would imagine so, yeah. Next up, we have Scattered Thoughts. This is an instant for 3 and a blue mana. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of those cards in your hand, and the rest in your graveyard. Finally, a nice, easy, simple card for me to read. So this is being tested by a whole 20% of testers with, again, a pretty high average rating of 2.2. I'm a little bit surprised, honestly, to see this card so highly up on the list. It's definitely a card that appeals to me personally. I like, again, these kinds of things that are plan Bs if you don't end up using your counterspell, and especially things that let you have some card filtering and put things in the graveyard. Just sets up a lot of interesting lines of play. We'll break down this data in a little bit more robust ways. In the future, we're working on our survey infrastructure, but I wonder if this might be another one that is highly tested by a lot of the Pauper and Peasant cubes.
I have to imagine that is what's going on here. I mean, we know cube designers tend to like flashy, complicated cards in a lot of circumstances, and I have to imagine not a ton of people that have access to rare cards are going to play this over Fact or Fiction or Memory Deluge or any one of the multiple 4 mana instant speed draw spells they could possibly have access to. But it's certainly a nice, clean iteration of this for our pauper and peasant friends, or people that just like simpler cards, even in their unrestricted cubes.
Yeah, I know that Reign of Revelation has been in my cube, for example, since the beginning, and it's really close. If blue was feeling overpowered right now, I think I would probably be interested in switching to Scattered Thoughts, although I'm actually not sure which one is really more powerful.
Is Reign of Revelation better than this? I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm still on Hieroglyphic Illumination in my cube. That's a common, right? Wasn't Hieroglyphic Illumination a common?
Yep.
So I get it. 4-mana instant speed, draw 2. It's great. Everyone loves it.
I did not love it in my deck, by the way, for what that's worth.
The Hieroglyphic Illumination you drafted in my cube, you didn't love it in your deck, you're saying?
Yes.
Just because it didn't trigger all your spell trigger stuff?
Just because I was losing and I had to cast the 4-mana side in order to find an answer, and I couldn't do so, and I died.
Okay, well, I mean, you could just cycle it then.
Yeah.
Sounds
I'm not saying there wasn't user error, but I'm blaming
some operator error there a little bit. Yeah. I'm so mad at this brainstorm because I saw that I'm going to lose this game because of the brainstorm, so it's a bad card.
I've Hieroglyphic Illumination locked myself by tapping 4 lands.
I've done it. Now I have not to do anything else this turn. Coming in at number 10, we have the only Planeswalker to break into the top cube cards list, and that is Sorin the Mirthless. This is 2 black for a legendary Planeswalker. Sorin enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty. Its +1 is look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card and put it into your hand. If you do, lose life equal to that card's mana value. Its -2 is create a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. And its -7 is win the game. It deals 13 damage to any target. You gain 13 life. This is I think a great bread and butter Planeswalker. I say bread and butter in the sense that this is a very common pattern we see for Planeswalkers. Around 4 mana value, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. They have a plus that generates card advantage, a minus that protects themselves, and a game-winning ultimate. And this certainly fits the bill. And I gotta say, it fits the bill better than a lot of the other black Planeswalkers that we've gotten in the past. It's something that I would say has been a kind of a hole for a lot of cube designers, has been this just very rock solid, reliable black Planeswalker at the 4-ish mana value slot. And Sorin definitely provides that. So I think we're seeing it score very highly here. 22% of our testers are playing it, rating at 2.1. And those are people that just know, I've been looking for a good 4-mana value Planeswalker that is not conditional on a specific game state to generate value. It doesn't care about being in a deck of a certain kind. It's not a build around. It's not a zombie payoff. It's just a good black Planeswalker. And I think that's what Sorin is going to provide for the cube designers that are interested in that. We gotta have something else to say about the Planeswalker that made it into the top set. Nobody has any other thoughts about Sorin?
I only have comments on the art, and you said this isn't an art podcast, so.
Which of the 14 different arts are you talking about specifically?
I'm talking about the Fang art.
It's really good.
It's pretty good.
The owner of our local game store opened a foil and showed it around the room before he immediately sold it for $200 on TCG Player or whatever.
Yikes!
But it's very beautiful. So I definitely get the appeal for that. Yeah, I'm just not in the market for a Planeswalker like this with my cube currently, but I think a lot of people are, and so that's why we're seeing it score very highly. And yeah, that fancy art is going to be, I think, the chase expensive fancy promo version from the set for a while, I expect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our next card is Ulvenwald Oddity. It's 2 green for a 4/4 creature beast with trample and haste. And for 7 mana, you can transform it into an even bigger trample haste. And I've just now noticed that it's also got some charming flavor text. So, check that out. But it's quite charming.
Check that out on your own time.
We're not going to read it to you.
That's
you have to go look that up.
No, yeah. As math professors would say, we leave that as an exercise for the reader. It's being tested by 22% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. And I think the appeal is in a big creature that's kind of like Questing Beast, but easier to read with charming flavor text.
Big bash your face in moose.
With keyword readable.
Yes.
Ulvenwald Oddity can be read and understood by all players at the table. You will not forget that damage can't be prevented. What? It says damage can't be prevented? Excuse me? Very weird.
It can damage Frazzled Editor, unlike Questing Beast.
There you go.
Actually, Questing Beast doesn't. Damage can't be prevented, so it can damage Frazzled Editor. And that's my deep cut for uncards.
What a mess.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Fell Stinger. This is 3 mana for a 3/2 with Death Touch. So 2 and a black, 3/2. Zombie, Scorpion. I'm reading this all wrong.
You know how there's what's it called? You know how there's an order of adjectives that makes sense in English, where
Yes.
like you would refer to it as like the big green slide. You wouldn't say like the green big
no.
slide. That just sounds all wrong to people.
Yep.
There's like researchers have like figured out that you're
Yep.
supposed to say like size first and color
Yep.
in the middle and like other descriptors in like other places. I feel like it's definitely an order to read a Magic card in. Like if you're like time for Fell Stinger, it's an uncommon. It has exploit. It costs 2 and a black. It has Death Touch. It's a 2/2. It's a 3/2.
Yeah.
Look,
that's not
Anyway,
right.
time to do it correctly now.
I'm sorry about my broken brain. The problem is I probably like title is maybe the last thing that I actually read on a Magic card, but that's where you should start.
Probably,
anyway.
yeah.
Next up, we have Fell Stinger. This is 2 and a black for a zombie scorpion with Death Touch and Exploit. When it exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, and it's a 3/2. So it's a nice little package of a scorpion that blocks well and can cash in one of your other creatures or cash in itself for another 2 cards.
I think it should have had some reference to Skull Clamp in it somewhere in the name or the art or something.
To Skull Clamp, why?
Because it does kind of a Skull Clamp thing. It draws you 2 cards.
It does more of a Knight's Whisper or a Sign in Blood.
It doesn't require you to sacrifice a creature. Look, I know
True.
Skull Clamp wasn't on
I see what
Innistrad.
yes.
I'm just saying like it'd be interesting if it was like Skull Ripper or something. Everyone will go, oh, because everyone would do the Leo.
You said the
Leo
title
meme,
in the thing.
pointing at the TV like Leonardo DiCaprio. You know that meme, right?
No,
I think
I
you
do.
I'll send it to you later, Anthony.
an exercise for the listener.
Another good uncommon for Peasant Cubes and also for people that I think are just supporting Aristocrats packages. If you're looking for more sack outlets that draw cards and replace themselves, it certainly is going to be a role player.
Yeah, I think it does a nice thing that it lets you, cash in tokens or creatures that just aren't really relevant anymore and really lets you dig through your deck a lot interact with a lot of different things all at once by drawing you a bunch of cards and interacting with your battlefield.
Like the idea of a Magic card that just the rules text says interact with your battlefield. Just do something. Interact with your battlefield.
Oh my god, it's like the Jace that just says look at your deck, and then there's the Garrick that says interact with your battlefield.
Dude, I wish we could. I've thought of so many ways we could try and express the joy that Jace designed by a player in our playgroup brought to us, but it does not translate to audio, I don't think. We just have to post the image somewhere. Somebody in our playgroup designed this parody Jace, and its +1 was just look at your deck.
Jace the brain guy.
It's Jace the brain guy whose +1 was look at your deck. And I like that it's for so many reasons. One, that it's basically just making fun of like dirtily blue planeswalkers that just move cards around and look at stuff. Also, does look at your deck mean look through your deck or just look at your deck? Like you can't look at the cards in it. You just look at it on the table. Like behold, perceive your deck. Perceive it briefly.
That's
anyway,
great.
I wish that whole thing would translate better to audio, but this is the best we're going to do, I think. So just trust us. Jace the Brain Guy is a work of art. We all love him. I'm so glad I get to talk about this next card. Here's one of the best things I like about our new set review episode structure, Anthony. It is that if we talk about a card in a previous episode, and when I'm editing, I think to myself, I wish I had said this about that card. There's a whole other episode where we have a chance to say that, and Hopeful Initiate is the card I'm most excited to say that about. This
Is that not what editing is?
I did actually edit in a little bit of myself saying, hey, this is what I meant to say, or thought I wish I had said here, but I'm going to do a better job right now. Hopeful Initiate is the 7th most popular card, 4 cubes from this set. It has 24% of our respondents testing it, an average rating of 2.0, and this is a 1-mana 1/2 with training. It's a human warlock, and it has 2 and a white to remove 2 +1/+1 counters from among creatures you control to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Here's what I wanted to say, Anthony, and I know you don't listen to the episodes, so you haven't heard this. Other listeners have already heard this. We talked a lot about how this is not that great in an aggressive deck in a lot of circumstances because compared to one of the many 2-powered 1-mana creatures we have in white, it can attack for 2 until turn 3 if you play it on turn 1. And here's what I got to say. Don't play it on turn 1. Play your 2-powered creature on turn 1 and play this on turn 2. Then the first time it attacks, it's already a 2/3. And you got to be more mana efficient on your second turn by also, portable holding their blocker or holding up Mana Tithe or whatever you like to do in your white decks, listener. This is not the aggressive 1-drop you play on turn 1. This is like Fairy Guidemother. In a pinch, if it's the only one you got, sure, you can play it on turn 1. It's fine. It's not embarrassing. But you don't want to play this on turn 1. You want to play this on turn 2.
Bravo. I have nothing to add.
Anthony's sassy face is not going to translate to audio. It's an audio medium, Anthony.
That's why I'm doing the snap claps.
I think this card is going to be quite good. We talked about how Reckless Impulse was rated relatively highly for its placement on the list at 2.3. This is 2.0, so it's above a lot of cards that are rated higher, 2.2, 2.2, 2.1. It's one of the lower ratings it's the lowest rating in the top 10 or 12 cards of the set. So people are, I think, pretty tepid about this one. They're like, yeah, it could be something. I'm not sure how to evaluate it. I'm just going to kind of rate it somewhere in the middle and test it out. And I understand that response. I think I was one of those people that was kind of around there. The more I think about this card, the more excited I get about it, though. And I do think it's going to add some depth and variety, not just some superficial depth where it's like, haha, now it's different, but in reality, it doesn't actually change the game at all. I think it is actually going to change the games a bit where this card resolves and you get to train it up a couple times. So I've grown more excited about this card since we talked about it last week, and I'm excited to test it in my own cube.
Our next card is Dread Fugue. It's a single black mana for a sorcery. Target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it with mana value 2 or less. That player discards that card.
Nice and clean.
Cast it for its cleave cost.
Oh, no!
You cleave out the phrase with mana value 2 or less. So it just becomes a Thoughtseize type card. It's being tested by a quarter of our respondents with an average rank of 2.2.
Are you among them, Parker?
I'm not. I run 2 Thoughtseize and 3 Duress and Inquisition of Kozilek, so I have no need for a messy version of a card I already have multiples of.
Yeah, if you're breaking Singleton for those cards, which are much cleaner, I think, then I would be in your same position. I would not be trying Dread Fugue either. But I'm still over here in mostly Singleton land, and so I'm still excited about this card. My feelings have not changed since we talked about it in the last episode.
Same. I'm still not interested in cleave cards.
Yeah, they do not take joy.
Yeah, they really don't. And I don't know. I feel like Wizards really nailed the power level and balance and gameplay of 1 mana discard spells, like some of the first times. And that's why they reprint Duress so often. And it's also why I don't feel bad about running multiples of it, because it's just the best effects that they've printed of it. So why should I limit myself to the bad ones?
That's a whole other episode we'll have to do sometime, Parker, where I just ask you, why aren't you running 6 Thoughtseizes or whatever? And we can have that conversation at a later date.
I would love to.
Number 5, we're coming into the home stretch, looking at the top cards that most cube designers are interested in.
Your number 5 top cube card from Innistrad, Crimson Vow.
That was good.
Is Cemetery Gatekeeper. So we've seen these cemetery cards a couple times and seen the way this sort of loose cycle kind of works. This one is 1 and a red for a vampire. It is a 2/1. It has first strike. When it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. And whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player.
This one cares about lands. The other ones don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. This one does.
And this one only triggers when it enters the enters the battlefield.
No attack trigger.
No attack triggers. First strike is cool. So this is being tested by 26% of respondents with an average rating of 2.2, which is definitely above average. Anything new to say about this card?
Card good. Still excited to test.
Yeah, I think it's going to, in the context of a lot of cubes where people are trying to play these, traditional, very aggressive red decks, this is going to, I think, play out very well where, assuming you can get a creature in the graveyard, and it can be either graveyard, right? Is that something else that's broken in these cycles?
Any graveyard.
Any graveyard, assuming you can nab a creature, or maybe what's actually maybe pretty interesting about this card is the fact that this cares more about what your opponent is doing in a lot of cases than what you're doing,
right,
which leads to a lot of sort of game time decisions. Regardless if this ends up being a thing that's difficult to block on its own and is going to deal 4 or 6 damage to your opponent as they're trying to get their feet under them to try and block it, it's going to be powerful, and I think there is that interesting sort of set of play patterns. So yeah, I think it's a cool card.
I always love Punisher effects like this, and I'm inclined to run them even if they don't otherwise fit perfectly in my cube, so I'm still really excited about this card. And a better way to articulate what I love about these Punisher cards is they give you a series of very small decisions where it's like, okay, I'm going to play this card. Am I going to exile that fetch land, or am I going to exile that ponder or something and try and hit their future sorceries? That's a small decision that will probably have some impact on the game, but it's not like earth-shattering. And then your opponent also gets these small decisions where it's like, okay, they named instant. I've got my instant speed removal held up end step. Do I just bite the bullet, take the 2 damage, and ulcerate that bad boy? I'm just taking 5 damage, I guess, if you do it that way. Do I bite the bullet and just shock that bad boy? Or do I untap and use my sorcery speed removal on it, which is not going to cost me 2 life, but it is going to cost me some mana efficiency on the next turn? Or do I maybe just avoid playing removal altogether and just play a bigger creature? It's a series of these small decisions where like you get to decide how you like navigate these Punisher mechanics. And so I really like it as like a soft Punisher mechanic. You know, it's not a really hard one like a Winter Orb, which is also very interesting. Which land do you untap and, you know, how to use that mana you have access to. But that one's a lot more punishing. This is like, it costs you something, but it's never going to completely derail the whole game. And so still very into this card and excited to play it.
Cemetery Gatekeeper, basically Winter Orb.
Hey now. I would argue that actually our number 4 card should have been our number 5 card because Cemetery Prowler is next. It has the exact same number of testers as Cemetery Gatekeeper, but scored slightly lower on the overall rating. This is the green Cemetery card. Its average rating is 2.1. It is 1 green for a 3/4 with Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, this one cares about attacking, exile a card from a graveyard, and then spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card type they share with cards exiled with Cemetery Prowler. You can play your Phyrexian Invoker for free if you've exiled an artifact and a creature with Cemetery Prowler, which is interesting. I'm still high on this card. I do think that the ability here of making spells cheaper is the least relevant of the abilities on all of the Cemetery cycle. You're mostly, I think, playing this for the Grave Hate and for the 3/4 Vigilance, and that upside of maybe things being cheaper is cool, but I imagine that most of the time I'm going to be deciding what I exile based on what I don't want in my opponent's yard rather than what I think is going to be cheaper for me in the future.
I think that's obviously, like everything, very context dependent, though. I could see, you know, the kinds of decks that... I could see you designing a cube that has a very proactive green section where you have cards like Reclusive Taxidermist, you know, maybe on the more expensive end, things like Goreclaw that are both sort of rewarding you for casting big creatures and helping you accelerate into your big creatures and at the same time being proactive and just getting your opponent dead. So I definitely think that if that is appealing to you, this could be a really key piece to a whole new kind of archetype. Whole new is an exaggeration, but, you know, something that we haven't seen quite as much in the most visible cubes.
Parker, this wolf's a 3/4. How big is a wolf?
I think I have no good answer for this. A wolf is...
See, in my head, wolves are 2/2s, but bears are 2/2s, much more canonically. So, I mean, wolves can't be 2/2s. They got to be smaller than bears.
A watch wolf is a 3/3.
That's true. Maybe more wolves are 3/3s, actually, in my head. Wolf's better than bears. You heard it here first.
Wow. Never thought of it like that.
Wow. Can't believe it. Wow.
Okay, our next... Andy, you are just a wellspring and a bottomless fount of obscure movie quotes.
I'm trying to bring the end. Owen Wilson is like one of the biggest movie stars in the whole world.
Yeah.
Him saying "wow," which he does in basically every movie, I feel like is a pretty mainstream thing. But
yeah, but it's just at the forefront of your mind. Like it's as easy as speech for you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next card is Graf Reaver. It's 1 and a black for a 3/3 creature zombie warrior. It has exploit. Whenever it exploits a creature, destroy target planeswalker. And at the beginning of your upkeep, Graf Reaver deals 1 damage to you. It's being tested by a third of our respondents with an average rank of 2.2 in our number 3 slot. It has my favorite form of planeswalker removal on it, which is power and toughness. But if that doesn't work out, then you also have this exploit mode, and you can either cast it as a sorcery style thing, or you can trade in your small token for a planeswalker, which is not a bad fallback plan, I think.
Yeah, I wonder how many times people are going to not play this on curve because they're like, what if my opponent plays a planeswalker? I'm going to want to be able to remove it. But if they had played it on curve, having a 3/3 would have allowed them to remove it by attacking.
Exactly. That's where I see a little bit of tension in this design. Then again, it's just like the floor is a 2-mana 3/3, and I'm a little too young of a...
You love Watch Wolves.
I do. I'm a little too young of a Magic player to have like really played in the Suicide Black days where all your creatures dealt damage to you. So I don't know how good or bad that is, but I'm excited to try this card.
Just gotta give it lifelink, baby. Then you're moving your life total around like a blue player moves their deck around. You're just...
Yeah. Blood Sorin is a planeswalker that says, change some life.
Pretty much.
Look at your life total.
Look at your life total. Yeah, I guess my tip for this card is don't sandbag this card. Don't wait to play it until your opponent has a Planeswalker. You should mostly be playing this as a 2-mana 3/3 in almost every environment. And then if you happen to draw it late game and your opponent happens to have a Planeswalker that you happen to not be able to remove any other way, then you got that mode there sitting there for you. Got that mode there sitting there.
Number 2 on the charts is Welcoming Vampire. This is 3 mana, 2 and a white, for a vampire 2/3 with flying. Whenever one or more other creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card.
We love drawing cards.
This ability triggers once each turn.
No, we don't love that at all.
I don't hate that. I mean, this card's kind of nuts. It's a big body, it's got flying, and it's just going to draw a card every turn.
Yeah, it was drawing comparisons to Mentor of the Meek, which it does clearly seem inspired by from the original Innistrad set. That card you had to
Bygone Bishop as
pay
well.
to draw cards. Yeah, Bygone. They usually do this kind of every Innistrad block, basically. But those cards, you had to pay to draw the cards, and here you don't. You just get to draw the card, which seems quite good.
It's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
So this card's being tested by 34%, over a third of our respondents, with an average rating of 2.2.
Parker, how good is my 3-drop drawing me an extra card every turn?
I think of it very, very similarly to Torens, in that if I have a cheap creature, this is a body that threatens to snowball, and it can gain me instant value on the turn I play it. If I go turn 4, Welcoming Vampire plus Curd Ape, I feel really good about myself.
You will mention Curd Ape. That's your nickname
yes.
for the next set review. I got to write that down now. Parker
All
Curd
right.
Ape LaMascus.
Bet. However, I think, man, the 2/3 flyer, and it only triggers once a turn.
That's plenty.
It just kills me. It kills me. I know I'm going to misplay with it. I know that it's not going to be quite as good as I want it to be. So I don't know. I'm torn.
It's funny. I feel like oftentimes I find myself being a little sad. Every Magic player is different. I don't play a ton of EDH, and I feel like a lot of mythic rare and rare slots and a lot of complexity and power level in a set, power level equity gets spent on cards that are kind of meant for EDH. And I'm like, man, that card seems like it's really good in multiplayer, really good when you can build around it, but it doesn't really work in the kind of Magic I like to play. Here, I think this card was nerfed because of EDH, because under regular Magic circumstances, I don't think you would be a lot of times where you get to resolve a 3-mana card, have it not be disrupted, and then you get to just draw a bunch of cards off of it by still having cheap creatures in your hand or ways to generate tokens and things like that. In EDH, it seems like it'd be very, very strong. This goes from like EDH staple for all time to probably like barely playable. You play it in like vampire decks, I would imagine, in most EDH decks. It is worth noting that it does trigger when creatures power 2 or less enter the battlefield, which is different than Torens, and generally speaking, I think quite a bit more powerful.
Yes.
So I think, in your example, Parker, like ideally you would have a Planeswalker in play already that ticks to make tokens, and you play Welcoming Vampire, you tick and make your token, you immediately get your card back, even if you didn't have extra mana or extra cards in hand to get the value off of it. So this, for me, falls into the category of card that is perfectly powerful enough, could totally cut it in my cube, would not be embarrassing. People would draft it and play it, they'd win games with it, but just doesn't do the things I want my white 3-drops to do. I like my top of my curve, which is what 3 is in my white section of my cube, to be things that are very disruptive. If you're in a situation where a white creature like Skyclave Apparition or Elite Spellbinder or one of these disruptive threats doesn't win you the game, and drawing a bunch of cards with Welcoming Vampire does, then it was probably a very long, drawn-out board stally game where you got to draw 2 or 3 cards or 4 or more off this Welcoming Vampire. Those are not the kind of games I'm trying to encourage, so it just doesn't do it for me, but it's definitely a powerful card, and I understand why 34% of our respondents are excitedly trying it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fairly narrow kind of context that you're describing. Like, a 3-mana spell, I don't think in a lot of cubes needs to be like the game-ending
I know, I just said
spell.
In my cube.
Right. I just want to just sort of underscore that, like, yeah, I think that it being a creature with flying that can get in some reach, it does damage, and can keep drawing you other ways to continue to do damage without costing anything is going to be powerful and effective in a lot of contexts. I actually think that last rider that only triggers once a turn is really important. I mean, can you imagine you cast this and then cast Lingering Souls and just draw 4 cards? Like, that would be quite backbreaking in a lot of contexts. So I kind of wish, if anything, that they just wrote it a little bit differently, because it does feel like a little bit of a bummer. You start reading, you're like, oh, okay, I can do this, and if I like set up this loop, and then they add that rider on it, maybe if it just said once a turn when this happens, like they could just phrase it in a way that
just
felt
so
more
the
positive.
good part was at the end instead of the beginning.
So you're like, once a turn. All right, what can I do once a turn? That's cool. I'm happy with that.
I think it was on an episode of the Resleevables that we were talking about Modern Horizons, where one of the designers was a guest, and he was talking about that specific thing, how like the order they put the things in will dramatically affect how playtesters perceive the card, and trying to not like bury the bad parts till the end, so it feels like it's raining on your parade is an important detail of a card design. We've arrived at the number 1 most popular cube card from Innistrad Crimson Vow, and it is Thirst for Discovery. Clocking in with 37% of our respondents testing this card and rating it 2.4, which is, I believe, the highest rating in the set for any card above a certain number of testers. There are some cards with much fewer testers that have a higher average rating just because 1 or 2 high scores really adjusted the average. This is 2 and a blue for an instant that says draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard a basic land card. This fits in with a kind of long arcing like thirst cycle where you have cards that draw you 3 cards and then you discard 2 unless you discard a specific type. We have the one that cares about you discarding artifacts, one that cares about you discarding enchantments, and this one cares about you discarding basic lands. These cards all end up seeing play in a lot of cubes because it's a pretty efficient card draw. It's better than a divination most of the time and at instant speed, and so that's quite good for a card like this. And then also cubes that have any reason to bin stuff and put it in the graveyard, being able to draw 3 and then bin anything from your hand is a pretty good way to get what you want in the graveyard. So I kind of overlooked this card just because this is not an effect I personally am looking for in my cube, but it's not surprising now that I see it and think about the broader context of cubes that this is among the most popular cube cards in the set. I have to say, though, one thing I did note is I think this card is maybe going to disappoint some people if you're on higher densities of fixing. I'm on a pretty high density of fixing in my cube, and it ends up being that substantially more than half of the lands in all of the decks in my cube, for the most part, are going to be non-basic lands. The only exceptions to this really are when you're playing a monocolored deck. If you're playing monocolored aggro, then you're not really prioritizing those non-basics and end up with still playing 7 or 8 mountains in addition to all the utility lands you're playing. But mono blue is not a thing in a lot of cubes, and so I think there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to go to discard your land and be like, oh wait, that's not a basic land. I need to discard 2 cards now, and that's going to be a bit of a bummer for people.
I like this kind of effect. We've talked about some similar ones in this set review already, and I've had Thirst for Knowledge in my cube for a long time. It's come in and out, but I would honestly love to just see like draw 3, discard 2 without that extra rider, which would be a downside. It would be a worse card, but it could be a little bit simpler. The fact that artifacts there is a little bit of an artifact theme in my cube, so I think that is still relevant. The basic land is almost like that's the obvious thing. That's what you want to be doing most of the time, right? Is of all the things you could be discarding as that extra rider to actually be up cards. Discarding a land is what you want to do, but actually I feel like it takes away a little bit of the modality of it in a way that I'm having trouble really thinking through.
Yeah, it also bears some resemblance to Compulsive Research, which is not quite the same kind of card because it's a sorcery, but it does draw you 3 cards, and then you discard 2 cards unless you discard any land card. So this is just making you discard a basic land and moving it to instant speed. I do think this card is probably pound for pound better than Compulsive Research. There's a lot of environments where you can't afford sorcery speed to tap out 3 mana and do nothing to affect the board or anything. But Compulsive Research is still pretty popular in quite a few cubes, and I think that all the cubes that are interested in Compulsive Research are likely to be pretty interested in Thirst for Discovery, which explains its high performance on the set survey. It is also an uncommon, so number 1 card from the whole set, not a rare, not a mythic rare, but a humble uncommon in Thirst for Discovery. Do you have thoughts about this card, Parker?
Yeah, so I was, I'll admit, a little surprised to see this in our top slot until I compared it to our past surveys, such as Midnight Hunt, whose top card was Consider. And if you go back and listen to that episode, or I will tell you, it was tested by 70% of our respondents, twice as much as Thirst for Discovery. And it was rated at 2.6, which is 0.2 higher than Thirst for Discovery. So that really clarified some things for me about this set. Compared to our past surveys that we've conducted, Crimson Vow is extremely low consensus. There are no cards tested even by half of the respondents. Even the most tested card is barely a third of our respondents.
That's a really important thing to point out. And if you compare it to a kind of exemplary set like Modern Horizons, I think the top dozen or 15 cards from Modern Horizons are all much more popular and much more broadly tested than the top card here, than Thirst for Discovery. So even though it does have the top slot, it doesn't necessarily speak to people adoring Thirst for Discovery. It speaks to the fact that there's really nothing in this set that people are like, yeah, this is a slam dunk in a broad range of cubes.
Right. And of course, I'm thrilled for the people who are thirsty for discovery, and I could not keep a straight face. I'm, of course, thrilled for the people who do enjoy thirst for discovery and are looking for that kind of effect in their cube. But it's interesting to me that that's not representative of the community as a whole in the same way that some of our prior top performing survey cards have been.
Yeah. Overall, the cards in this set rated pretty lowly and were not tested by huge chunks of the respondents. So not a standout set in terms of the things we're measuring with this survey. And on that bombshell, on that whisper, some things, sometimes the world ends with a whisper, not with a bang. We've concluded our community set review. Thank you to everybody who filled out the survey and who sent in their hot takes. We'll be continuing to do that for future sets. So if you want to make sure you don't miss a survey or an opportunity to send in a hot take, you can subscribe to our newsletter on the homepage of our website. We never really point people to the newsletter. We don't talk about it a whole lot, but it is there. And it's, I promise you, very infrequent because A, I don't have that much time to write it, and B, it costs me $9 every time I send it out. So it's only the good stuff. I'm only going to send you the really good stuff, not just spam your inbox. So if you want to make sure you don't miss that, sign up for our email newsletter on the homepage of the website. Any closing thoughts on this set?
Overall, I think that this set brings a couple more interesting things. I really like blood tokens, but I think the design space, let's just say there's a lot more design space yet to be explored. So I look forward to blood tokens coming back again. I was similarly kind of hoping to see more clues come back and investigate, that we had talked about them at Midnight Hunt. But again, looking at the set with blood tokens having clues and blood at the same time, I see why that could have gotten a little bit confusing. And the biggest thing I'll say is I hope we're moving away from double face cards in the near future, because that really takes a big chunk of cards just sort of off the table for me for most of my cube projects.
I have a higher tolerance for double face cards than you do, but still don't prefer them. And I just feel like it's been a constant with every set for the past 18 months, and I am ready for a break. Give me some magic cards with a normal magic back. I love that brown thing, whatever it is. The cover of a tome, I think, is what it's supposed to be.
Something else that's interesting in this specific review is I think we've actually touched on very few cards that really interact with the graveyard in a deep way, and that is one of the biggest themes. So I would definitely say something yet to be explored by the community is all these interesting stuff that we can do with all these new graveyard focus cards.
Yeah, the things I'm most excited about from the set are Cemetery Gatekeeper, which again, kind of ticks two boxes of cards I've wanted for a long time, for the cheap red Punisher effect for both lands and spells. And all these cards that give me this incidental grave hate for my environment, which has more and more Graveyard Matters stuff just kind of laced through every deck, basically. The fact that I care more about the types of cards in my graveyard, Occult Epiphany specifically references the card types you're discarding. It's just more players will be looking at the things that are relevant to all the decks, which I think is a good direction for the cards to go. I think it's a weird tension when you have decks that really care about something other decks completely ignore, where their cards don't even reference the thing in question. And here, having cards that just incidentally interact with graveyards, let you exile stuff, and cards that remind you to check the types of things is going to help keep the relevant information at the forefront of all the players' minds in my own environment. All right. Well, Parker, thank you for taking your... Blah. Well, Parker, thank you for... Oh, my God. Well, Parker. Parker, thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday night to chat with us before the holiday. I appreciate it, and your perspective is always welcome on the podcast.
We're doing great.
We're falling apart collectively.
As the person that edits the podcast, I can also say that your lack of misspeaking is also very welcome on the podcast. If you would like to maybe give Anthony and I tips on how not to misspeak, that would be great.
Oh boy, I'll think about it.
All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by speaking into microphones across state lines and through Zoom. Thank you, Anthony and Parker, for talking about Magic cards with me.
Thanks for talking about this new set with me. I'm excited to update some cubes.
Thanks for having me. I had a blast, and I'm looking forward to playing Crimson Vow.